October 11th, 1969. 9:58 p.m. SFPD officers Doan Falk and Eric Zums are rolling through Presidio Heights. Quiet neighborhood. Wealthy. Tree-lined. The kind of streets where the worst thing that usually happens is a noise complaint. 2 minutes ago, a call came in. Cab driver shot. 1 block away. They are heading there now. And as they come down Jackson Street, they see him. White male, heavy-set, crew-cut, dark jacket, walking away from the direction of the crime, calm, unhurried, like a man heading home after dinner, moving toward the Presidio. They keep driving, not because they are incompetent, because dispatch told them they were looking for a black male. 1 transcription error, 1 wrong description broadcast over the radio, and 2 officers obeying that broadcast saw the right man and kept driving. For 50 years, that has been told as tragedy. As the night the Zodiac slipped through a crack that should not have existed. What I want to show you is that there was no crack. He built it. He did not just get away. He spent months designing a system in which getting away was the only possible outcome. He studied the exact tools that would be used to catch him, identified every place they failed, and built his crimes inside those failures. I have the proof. I want to start with something I almost missed entirely. Most people who go deep on the Zodiac case spend months focused on what he did at each crime scene. The weapons, the wounds, the letters. I did too. For a long time. Then one afternoon, I pulled back, and I looked at something different. I looked at a map of who was in charge of investigating the crimes, not where they happened, but which agencies had jurisdiction over each one, and something felt wrong. Northern California in 1969 was a patchwork of separate law enforcement fiefdoms. Benicia had its own police department. Vallejo had its own. Napa fell under county jurisdiction. San Francisco was SFPD, operating as its own world with its own cases. Its own filing systems, its own internal politics. These agencies shared almost nothing. No common radio channels. No shared databases because digital databases did not exist. Fingerprint cards and suspect profiles lived on paper, in filing cabinets, and were mailed between departments when anyone bothered to mail them. There was no legal obligation for any of these agencies to coordinate with any other. Picture it literally. A bulletin board in the Solano County Sheriff's Department. A separate bulletin board in the Vallejo Detectives Room. A third in the Napa Sheriff's Office. A fourth in a San Francisco Homicide Unit. Different buildings, different cities. No mechanism connecting them. An investigator in Vallejo could be working the same killer as an investigator in San Francisco, and never know the other man existed. That is exactly what happened. Now look at where the Zodiac struck. December 1968. Lake Herman Road, Benicia City Limits, Solano County. Solano County Sheriff's Department Territory. July 1969. Blue Rock Springs Park, Vallejo, a completely separate agency. September 1969. Lake Berryessa, Napa County Sheriff's Jurisdiction. October 1969. Presidio Heights, San Francisco. SFPD 4 attacks. 4 separate law enforcement agencies. 0 legal requirement for any of them to share what they knew. My first reaction was coincidence. He attacked near where he lived. He went where opportunity found him. I almost talked myself out of it. Then I looked more carefully. Benicia and Vallejo sit 5 miles apart, but they fall under different jurisdictions. He attacked the Benicia side. He drove past lakes and parks near home to reach Lake Berryessa an hour away, in a completely separate county. And for his fourth attack, he crossed the entire San Francisco Bay into a neighborhood he had no documented reason to visit. That is not where opportunity found him. That is a route planned around borders that most people do not even know exist. The question everyone asks about the Zodiac is, why did he pick those victims? Almost nobody asks, why did he pick those jurisdictions? He picked them because an investigator in Napa had no automatic channel to an investigator in SFPD, because he had read the institutional map and understood precisely where the system's edges were. The choice of location was the first piece of design. That was the moment I stopped thinking this was coincidence. Then I found the payphones. The Zodiac called police after every attack to report what he had done. Most people know this. It reads as arrogance. The showman. The narcissist who needs to take credit. That is part of it. But look at where he was calling from. After the Blue Rock Springs shooting in Vallejo, he called Vallejo PD. The call was traced. The payphone was blocks from the Vallejo police station. After the Lake Berryessa stabbing in Napa, he called the Napa police. The call was traced to a payphone at a car wash on Main Street in Napa, blocks from the police station. Picture what that looks like. He is standing at a payphone. The police station is down the street. He picks up the receiver. He dials. A dispatcher answers. He reports the crime, calmly, with details that prove he was there. He sets the receiver down and walks away. Down the street, someone is grabbing their keys. In 1969, tracing a payphone call required contacting the telephone company. They had to manually backtrace the call through physical switching stations, several minutes minimum, often longer. By the time the first unit rolled out, he was gone. And here is what I could not get past. In both cases, the payphone was near the station, not near the crime scene. He drove away from where he had just struck toward the center of town and called from next to the building full of people who were now looking for him. Whether he chose those specific phones deliberately, or whether proximity to the station was simply where his route took him, the result was the same. The gap between his call and their arrival was exactly large enough. He had done the math before he made the call. That is when I stopped giving him the benefit of the doubt. I kept going, and the weapons did not make sense until they did. Lake Herman Road, a .22 caliber firearm, 10 shell casings, a clean ballistic signature, Blue Rock Springs, a 9mm handgun, 7 casings, completely different weapon. Lake Berryessa, a knife, long, heavy, bayonet style, taped wooden handle, no gun at all, Presidio Heights, a 9mm handgun. Ballistics confirmed it was not the same one used at Blue Rock Springs. Criminal profiling in 1969 ran on weapon signatures. A consistent weapon creates a forensic thread. Casing markings link crime to crime. They force investigators to understand they are looking for one person. They build a profile that narrows the suspect pool. The Zodiac left no thread. The ballistic link between the first two shootings had to be established weeks after the fact through careful technical comparison. The knife attack at Berryessa belonged to a completely different forensic category, and by the time SFPD stood over Paul Stein's body in San Francisco, there was no automatic reason to connect that scene to a stabbing in a lake an hour away. For weeks, investigators in Vallejo and investigators in San Francisco did not know they were hunting one man. The Zodiac had to write them a letter to explain it. Think about that for a second. He controlled when they understood the shape of what they were looking at, until he chose to narrate it. 4 separate agencies worked 4 separate cases that were actually one. I sat with that for a long time. 4 weapons, 4 forensic categories, 4 agencies, and the only thread connecting them was one he was holding. But there is a moment in this case that I keep coming back to, a detail that changed everything. Lake Berryessa, September 27th, 1969. A remote peninsula in Napa County, late afternoon. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard are picnicking when a figure steps out from behind an oak tree. He is wearing a hood. Not a ski mask, not something pulled from a shelf. A square-shaped black hood, custom-made, cut and sewn by hand from black fabric. The eye holes are positioned and covered with clip-on sunglasses. On his chest, a separate bib, also hand-sewn, also attached, bearing a white crosshair symbol 3 inches across. His symbol in his pockets. Lengths of plastic clothesline. Pre-cut. I kept coming back to that word. Pre-cut means he measured the lengths before he left the house. He knew how many people he would need to restrain. He cut the rope to fit them in advance. The hood disturbed me, not because it was theatrical, because of what it cost to make. That hood was not commercially available. He cut and shaped it himself, fitted to stay on a human head during a violent physical struggle. He positioned the clip-on sunglasses by estimating his own eye spacing when he cut. The bib was constructed separately and attached. The crosshairs were applied by hand. Brian Hartnell later said it looked like it was made with a machine or with some degree of care. It was not scrolled on. It was proportional. This took hours, possibly days. And then he wore it in full costume, in broad daylight. 500 yards through open parkland to reach 2 people on a blanket. He wore it because of what it prevented. Hartnell and Shepard could not describe his face, not because they were frightened or not paying attention, because there was no face. There was a hood, a bib, a calm voice that is all they could offer investigators. The only composite sketch that exists in this entire case came from Presidio Heights. 3 teenagers who glimpsed a man through a window across a street at night for a matter of seconds. At every other crime scene, there was no face to describe. He designed a mask specifically to defeat the most basic form of identification that existed, human visual memory. And then, after Presidio Heights gave investigators that one partial sketch, the first visual anchor the investigation had ever had, he dealt with it. Less than a month after killing Paul Stein, after the sketch had been printed, distributed, and published across the Bay Area, after the investigation had built its entire visual foundation around that image, he mailed a letter to the San Francisco Chronicle. The composite sketch, he explained, did not look like him because he had been wearing a disguise that night. stop there for a second. He waited until the sketch was everywhere. He let it circulate. He let it become the face of the case. And then he published, in his own handwriting, in a letter verified by the FBI, the information that the most important piece of visual evidence in the investigation was unreliable. Before a single arrest, before a single suspect had been formally named, if he were ever arrested and that sketch placed before a jury, his defense attorney would not need to argue against it. They could hold up the Chronicle and read his letter aloud. He did not destroy the evidence. He poisoned it, preemptively, publicly, in print. That was not a man trying to escape. That was a man who had already thought about the courtroom. At some point during these 8 months, I had to stop and ask myself a genuine question. Not who is he? We will get to that. But who does this? What kind of person thinks in terms of jurisdictional blind spots, payphone placement, ballistic non-patterns, pre-measured clothesline, published preemptive exculpatory evidence? This is not what panic looks like. This is not what impulse looks like. So look at what the physical evidence actually points to. Wing walker boots at Berryessa, size 10.5. Military-issue aviation footwear, though they were also available as surplus to civilians and to workers at Air Force bases. The bomb diagrams he sent later, functional, detailed enough that law enforcement treated them as credible threats. The knowledge of police radio communications, precise enough to describe the exact APB error in his own letter, 1 month after the Presidio Heights shooting. The Cypher construction, a homophonic substitution system with documented military cryptographic routes. None of those things alone closes the case on who he was, but together, they are the traces of a man who had spent time inside institutions, learning how they function, where they communicate, where they fail, and built his crimes to fit inside those failures. That profile has never been officially closed, and it matters for what comes next, because the letters were not just communications. They were something stranger than that. July 1969, his first cipher, 408 characters. He divided it into 3 equal segments and mailed each one to a different newspaper simultaneously. The Chronicle, the Examiner, the Vallejo Times-Herald. Here's the problem that created. To publish the complete cipher, each newspaper needed pieces from the other 2, which meant they needed to cooperate. But these were commercial rivals. The Chronicle and the Examiner competed for the same readers, the same advertisers, the same front pages, and he gave them a 3-day deadline, backed by a kill threat. Think about what every editor in that room faced on their own, without talking to the others. A story their rivals also had, a deadline, a direct threat if they held it. Their competitor published first. None of them were going to sit on this. That is exactly what he knew. He had designed a situation where the rational decision for every editor, made independently, without coordination, was the same decision, and it was the decision he needed them to make. By the time police were notified, the editorial decisions were already final. He understood how newspapers worked better than most of the people running them, and then came the school buses. 2 days after killing Paul Stein, he mailed a letter threatening to shoot out the front tire of a school bus and pick off the children as they came out. Weeks later, a 7-page follow-up containing engineering diagrams for a photoelectric cell bomb, a device designed to detonate on contact with bus headlights. Every school bus route in the region now needed police assessment. Officers were assigned to escorts. SFPD divided itself further between a homicide investigation and a permanent open threat. He never touched a school bus. He never intended to. After Presidio Heights nearly caught him, he had adjusted his calculus. He found that a stamp, a diagram, and a credible threat could occupy an entire police department as effectively as a murder, and required him to be nowhere near anyone. Every officer on escort duty was one fewer officer building a case file. He found that out, and he used it. Here's what I want you to hold in your mind before we go any further. Everything I have described, the jurisdictions, the payphones, the weapons, the costume, the sketch, the letters, the school buses, all of it was designed against 1969, against the specific tools, the specific institutions, the specific limitations of one particular moment in history. He was extraordinarily good at reading his present moment. What he could not do was see past it. I need to talk about the ciphers, because this is where the case gets genuinely strange. December 2020, Virginia, Australia, Belgium, 3 people, David Orenchak, Sam Blake, and Joe Van Eyck. They finally decoded the Z340, the 340-character cipher the Zodiac had mailed to the Chronicle in November 1969. 51 years earlier, military cryptanalysts had worked it. The FBI had worked it. Hundreds of professional and amateur codebreakers across 5 decades had taken their runs at it and walked away. When the team finally broke it, here is what they found inside. The Zodiac had used a diagonal transposition lattice, reading down 1 row and over 2 columns, combined with a homophonic substitution system. Take a moment with that. This is not a simple substitution code where A becomes 1 and B becomes 2. This is a system where the letters are first scrambled diagonally across the cipher, then replaced with symbols. Multiple different symbols can represent the same letter, which defeats frequency analysis. The standard tool codebreakers use to find patterns. It takes real knowledge to construct, real knowledge, and real patience. But buried in the second block was an error, a misalignment, a section where the diagonal system had been applied incorrectly. And that single error is the reason 51 years passed before anyone solved it. Every time a codebreaker got close, the broken section produced gibberish. The natural conclusion was that their approach was wrong. So they backed up, started over, tried a different method. The cipher looked solvable. It was almost solvable. The error sat precisely at the point where every codebreaker would check first. And every time they checked, it pointed them away from the answer. You cannot open a broken lock with the right key. The team cracked it using software capable of testing 650,000 transposition variations automatically, correcting for construction errors, and checking each result for real English. That technology did not exist in 1969. It barely existed in 1989. Was the error deliberate? I do not know. I genuinely do not know. But I have shown you a man who selected crime scenes based on institutional blind spots, placed calls from near police stations during the exact window when trace calls could not close the distance, published his own exculpatory evidence before any arrest, and designed clothing specifically to defeat eyewitness identification, a cipher that defeats codebreakers more effectively because of an error than it would if it were perfect, because the error makes solvers distrust their own correct approach. I stopped being willing to call it coincidence a long time ago. And then there were the other two ciphers, the ones that are never going to be solved. Z13, 13 characters preceded by the phrase, "My name is," the Z32, 32 characters, mailed with a hand-drawn map of Mount Diablo. Not because we have not tried hard enough, because of mathematics. A 13-character cipher lacks the statistical length to verify a unique solution. That is a mathematical property of short ciphers. Provable, not debatable. Any 13-letter name can be engineered to fit the symbols. Every answer is as valid as the next. Every answer is also as invalid. There is no solution. There can never be a confirmed solution. Not in 1969. Not today. Not with whatever technology comes next. He wrote, "My name is." He handed the world what looked like a key. The key does not open anything. It never did. It never will. Think about what happened next. Decades of researchers, anagram generators, computer analysis, some of the most obsessive amateur investigation in the history of American true crime, all of it aimed at a lock that has no opening. He gave thousands of people a puzzle that looks like a puzzle, functions like a puzzle, and generates the same effort and dedication as a real puzzle that cannot be solved, while he went wherever he went, and let them work. There is one last thing I need to show you. In 2002, forensic scientist Sidney Holt extracted a partial DNA profile from the Zodiac's November 1969 letter. From saliva residues on the stamps and envelope flap, partial, degraded, heavily contaminated. By 1999, when investigators reopened the cold case, they found the archive in ruins. Decades of retired police officers walking out with original letters and physical artifacts as personal mementos, handling surfaces that were supposed to be evidence. But here is the detail I could not stop thinking about. The later letters, the ones forensic analysts believe are forgeries, written by different people, yielded rich, abundant, easily extractable DNA, the 1978 City Pig letter, the 1974 Exorcist letter, high-quality profiles usable. The letters believed to have actually been written by the Zodiac. Almost nothing. The simplest explanation is age. The authentic letters are older. DNA degrades. But serology, the forensic analysis of biological fluids, was a documented investigative technique by 1969. It was established in case law. A man who could describe a specific radio dispatch error in exact detail 1 month after a crime might have understood that saliva on a stamp was evidence. The people who wrote the forgeries were not careful. They licked stamps. They left themselves behind, maintaining his control of the narrative from a safe distance. Then, in 1974, even that became too costly. Interagency cooperation was slowly improving. Forensic science was advancing. The exposure was no longer worth it. A man who had spent years reading systems knew when a system was catching up. He did not disappear because the investigation went cold. The investigation went cold because he decided to leave. He engineered an exit at the moment of maximum power, on his own terms, before the world he had studied could close around him, and somewhere he went home. Here's what he could not plan for. April 24th, 2018. Citrus Heights, a quiet suburb just outside Sacramento. Law enforcement arrested Joseph James D. Ingelo at his house. He was 72 years old. He had committed at least 13 murders and more than 50 sexual assaults across California. He had evaded capture for more than 40 years. He was not caught because of a fingerprint match. His prints were not in any database. He was caught because investigators uploaded a partial DN, a profile from one of his old crime scenes, to a public genealogy database. They found distant relatives, people who had submitted their own DNA for ancestry reasons and had no idea what they were connecting themselves to. Investigators built a family tree, eliminated branches, narrowed the field, arrived at a name, arrived at a house. He was an old man with a routine. He had a life. He had neighbors who waved at him. He had no idea anyone was coming. The Zodiac's partial DNA profile exists. Extracted in 2002. Old. Degraded. Extensively contaminated. It may fall below the threshold for reliable genealogical matching. That is a genuine technical uncertainty, not an excuse. But it exists. Genetic genealogy does not require a perfect sample. It requires enough unique markers to identify shared ancestral segments. The Golden State Killer was identified from a partial profile. So what stands between the Zodiac's profile and a genealogical database search? Legal authorization that has not been obtained. No active investigator assigned full time to the case. A cold case unit shuttered in 2004 because of budget constraints. A case technically open and practically waiting. And then, in December 2023, something happened. The Placer County Sheriff's cold case team announced that a skull found off Highway 20, near Interstate 80, in 1986 had been positively identified. It belonged to Donna Lass, a nurse who disappeared from a South Lake Tahoe casino in September 1970, whose case had been linked to the Zodiac for decades, though that connection was never officially confirmed. Unidentified for 53 years, identified through DNA analysis. The skull was matched against a sample from Donna Lass's own sister, which South Lake Tahoe police had collected years earlier for the missing persons case. In this investigation's orbit, using forensic DNA science, 2 years ago, modern DNA technology works on cases from this era. That much is no longer in question. The sample exists. The database access does not. I want to leave you with one image. Somewhere, right now, there may be a very old man. He has lived a long life since 1974. Decades of ordinary days, a routine. Maybe a neighborhood where people know his name or do not. He has had 50 years to believe that what he built held, that the system he designed to protect him did its job, that the story ended when he decided it ended. In April 2018, the news came on. Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, arrested at his house outside Sacramento, identified not by anything he did wrong, not by a witness, not by a mistake, but by a technology that reached backward through generations of family history to find him. Ordinary people submitting DNA to ancestry websites. Investigators building a family tree he did not know existed. A net assembled from the outside and closing quietly before a single officer knocked on his door. I think about what that moment felt like for the Zodiac. Not fear, exactly, something more specific than fear. The recognition that the rules had changed while he was not looking, that the tools coming for him are not the tools he planned against, that somewhere in a database, a cousin he has never met made a decision he knew nothing about, and that decision is a thread, and the thread leads somewhere. He built himself immune to 1969. He has been living in 2026 for a long time. Those are not the same world. In December 2020, the Z340 finally gave up its message. Words the Zodiac had sealed in November 1969, certain they would never be read, behind a broken diagonal lattice that sent every codebreaker in the wrong direction for 51 years. Behind software he never imagined. Behind 3 people on 3 continents who spent years building the right tool. I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. He thought that was sealed forever. He was wrong about that. He may be wrong about more,